you, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here. And yes, indeed, we will get to hearing a little bit about the War of 1812 as it played out on that particular part of the Thames River. And I'm sure you've all noticed that the picture up there is indeed of our lovely river. It is the Lower Thames, and it is what the Moravians would have seen from their mission settlement as they gazed down into the river on a good day. If you travel west from London, about an hour, on Highway 2, you will get to a small museum on the left-hand side of the road. It looks like that, very inconspicuous small building. It's sort of private, not too many close neighbors by, and you could miss it if you drive by quickly. And it is about, I would say, 1.5 kilometers before you get to Thamesville, if you know that area at all. And adjacent to this museum, which houses an awful lot of Indian artifacts, and of course it tells the largest story of the Moravian mission, which is what we're talking about today. Adjacent to that, you will see an 18th century replica of a typical wooden block house, as they call them, and and I'll get back to these houses when I talk more about the village itself. You would also see, if you actually stopped and looked, you would also see sort of an ancient road, or evidence of an old road, crossroad, and an obelisk, which, as you can see, I don't know if you can read that, but it hints, yes, thank you, at history having been made here some 300 years ago. And indeed, it had. It was here that the Moravian Indians' mission settlement called Farfield thrived from 1792 to 1813. The settlement met a tragic end in 1813 when American troops razed it to the ground in the War of 1812. 2 years later, in the spring of 1815, the Moravians rebuilt another mission, or built a new mission across the river, and called it New Fairfield. And New Fairfield today is Moravian town. So the new mission of New Fairfield was the nucleus of what is Moravian town today. Moravian town today is indeed home to the Canadian branch of the Delaware First Nation. And I'm here to talk to you tonight about this mission settlement and share with you a little bit about what I certainly think is fascinating history of early southwestern Ontario. You have to keep in mind that then, 1792, this part of the world was pretty well rough and tumble frontier land. Certainly, if you looked at it from the perspective of a European settler coming in. For natives, of course, it had been a fruitful, vast hunting ground for myriads of tribes over the centuries. Now, Fairfield did not get started in piecemeal fashion. That is, it wasn't a case of 1 or 2 missionaries coming into this wilderness and trying to bring the gospel to local natives and growing the mission from there. It wasn't like that. In fact, what it was an entire community moved in together, all at once. They were indeed refugees, still fleeing from the far-reaching effects of the American Revolutionary War, even though that had been fought many years before, well, some years before. So when Fairfield was founded, it had 157 inhabitants, 6 missionaries, and 151 Delaware natives, mostly Delaware. Most of these folks, of course, had known each other for a long time. They had lived together in other mission settlements over the years in various parts in what is the northern United States today, Pennsylvania, Ohio, even Michigan. So the question I want to answer for you today is, first of all, who were these people, and how did they end up on the Thames River in 1792? So first of all, let me say a few words about the missionaries. As I said, there were 6 in all at the foundation of the mission, 2 married couples and 2 single brothers. And these folks were members of an organization that was worldwide. Farfield, sorry, I should have shown you that too. The mission following. Okay. This organization was called the Unitas Fratrum, or the United Brethren. And it was a worldwide movement that started in Germany in the early 18th century. What we need to know about the United Brethren is that they were not sectarians. These were not people who had broken away from any kind of denominational church. No. They were not like Mennonites or Quakers or anything like that. They were indeed Lutherans. Lutherans who adhered to the Augsburg Confession, but they were evangelical, which means that they advocated a more heartfelt religion. All right? This is what evangelicals do. So the movement began in Germany, but it could trace its roots, literally, to an early 15th century movement of a similar type that was sort of a pre-Reformation Protestant movement in Moravia, which is part of the Czech Republic today, hence the term Moravian. Okay. But the modern movement, as I said, begins in Germany under the tutelage and leadership of this man who was a Lutheran minister and an aristocrat, Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf. This man, being an aristocrat, and certainly he was a Habsburg, by the way, had a lot of, Protestant Habsburg, had a lot of connections around the world. And it is because of that that the movement was able to grow so quickly. And by the end of the 19th century, you had missionaries from this organization bringing the gospel to what they called heathens, to all sorts of indigenous people around the world, 4 continents to be exact. They were in Greenland, in Suriname, in South Africa, the Gold Coast, Algeria, Arctic Russia, Ceylon, which of course is Sri Lanka today, and of course North America, including the most remote places of Labrador. Now, their work in North America began in the late 1730s. They started in Georgia, but they moved north to Pennsylvania, where they, in 1741, founded a place called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We know it as the erstwhile steel town of Pennsylvania. It was indeed a Moravian mission settlement to begin with, and it started from there. Bethlehem remained the headquarters of all the missions that the Moravians would conduct in the northern part of the North American continent, or what is the United States today. So they would answer to them, and Bethlehem in turn would answer to the Unity Brethren in Germany. Now, each mission was mandated, no matter where they were, each mission had a mandate to keep daily journals, and Farfield, of course, was no exception. And this is why we know so much about this settlement, because the Moravians were prolific writers. We have accounts of their daily happenings from the day the mission was founded and even before to the day it was destroyed. These diaries would be sent off to Bethlehem, where they would be copied and recopied and sent through the entire network. It was a system that was geared to educating people about the rest of the world. In other words, natives in Farfield would get to know about their other native brothers, if you will, in Suriname, in Caribbean, and in Arctic Russia. So it was geared to educating Now, most of the originals of these records are now kept in the archives in Bethlehem. There's also a Moravian archive in London, England, and of course a large one in Herrenhut in Germany. So astounding number of records, not only daily journals, but we have heaps of letters from all these missions. We have accounting books, we have minutes of conference meetings, and so on and so on. And of course they are a treasure trove for historians, for anthropologists, for genealogists, and the like. Trouble is, much of these records, many of these records rather, were written in German script. Not all, but a lot, that looked something like this. And it is a script, alas, that few people are able to read any longer, but some of us still can, and so we have put our efforts into translating as much or as many of these records as we possibly could. Much, much more has to be done. Okay, so those are some of the initial things I wanted to tell you. Now, when Farfield was built in 1792, the chief missionary or senior missionary was someone who you might have heard of before. He was the well-known missionary David Zeisberger. Zeisberger had spent his whole life, he came to North America as a young man and spent his whole life living among and working with native peoples. I have a nice picture painted by Height. This is Zeisberger preaching to the Indians. It is now, you can visit it in the Moravian archives in Bethlehem. So one man was in charge, but all the other missionaries had pastoral duties as well. It wasn't just up to one man to conduct the religious community. All missionaries, including wives, did that. Okay. Also, the missionaries were aided by what they called national helpers or native helpers. And these were native people who had been with the mission for a long time, who were probably older, who had made it through to be communicant members of the congregation, i.e. bona fide Christians, as the Moravians would call them, and so on. And we can't underestimate the importance of these native helpers in running the mission smoothly. They were church attendants, they were translators, many of them were multilingual, they were disciplinarians if there was cause, and so on. So it's not too much to say that without native helpers, these missions would not have survived. No major decision in the community affecting the welfare of the community was ever made without consulting these native helpers first. Now, most of the inhabitants, the natives, were Delaware, as I said, properly known as Lenape. Delaware, of course, is an English term, comes from Lord Delaware, the first governor of Virginia, who happened to name the entire area and the people he found there early on. The Delaware called themselves the Lenape, which means people. And as you can see by this map, and it's a modern map, more or less, there are homelands where on the eastern seaboard, where you see that red circle, around the Delaware River Basin, New Jersey, and even in eastern parts of Pennsylvania. Later on, of course, they moved further west. Now, the history of the Delaware after European contact is much like any other history of that nature. It's a story of both permissive and forced acculturation. It's a story of losing their lands, both by honest and dishonest means. It's a story of war and tribal disunity and so on. And it's also a story of Indian conversion to Christianity. When the eastern seaboard got really crowded with Europeans and push began across the Appalachian Mountains, most native peoples who were living there began to move west, and the Delaware were no exception. So they moved, as you can see by the red line, first into western Pennsylvania, on into Ohio, and so on. It is in Pennsylvania, right here, and I'm making the Moravians in green dots, that Seisberger and his cohorts first began to missionize among the Delaware, very early on in the 1740s. In his effort over time, and I can't go into too much detail, but his effort over time really paid off. Because by the time they reached the Ohio country, the Moravian missions were at their peak, counting 400 converts living in several mission settlements in Ohio. All right? So they had moved west with the non-Christian Delaware, who are indicated by the red line. As you can see by the lines, they lived in close proximity to their kinfolk who were non-Christian, but they lived together in peace and harmony. There was not a lot of trouble between them. Times were good. This was a great area for agriculture. Each community planted foodstuffs and so on. And once he was on the Thames River, Seisberg would write in his diary, he would often lament the bygone days, of the good old days on the Muskingum River. The Muskingum River is where they had their settlements. And the Muskingum runs into the Ohio River. It's just a branch of the Ohio River. But the good times don't last in the Ohio Valley, because the Revolutionary War had broken out, and that war created havoc among all Indian tribes. It simply was devastating, because it split the tribes in their allegiance and how they supported the various belligerents and so on. So it was not a good thing. Most of the non-Christian Delaware in the American Revolution supported the American, or the rebels. A small group of Delaware, whom we call the Muncies, and I'm sure you've heard that term, because we have some Muncies on the Thames as well, they supported the British. So right away you had a tribal split in the allegiance to the contenders in this war. What did the Moravian Delaware do? The Indian Delaware, the Christians? They embraced neutrality. And that worked to their detriment in the long run. They soon discovered a truism, which is that there is no such thing as a neutral in a war zone. If you're living in the middle of a war zone and you say, I'm neutral, chances are either side is going to suspect you of spying for the enemy. And that's certainly how the British viewed that group of Christian Indians. And so in order to get them away from American influence, the British forcefully removed them further up towards Lake Erie, moved them up here to the lower part of Lake Erie. It was winter time. They were actually relocated in a harsh manner. Couldn't take anything with them, driven like cattle actually, and not too kindly treated by the British, I might add. Not only that, Seisberger and his cohorts were charged with treason and hauled off to Detroit to stand trial. So here we have this 400 group, a large group of Christian natives in a strange area in the wintertime facing starvation. And they had no choice at all but to disperse in small groups looking for food and staying alive somehow. And one group of about 100 returned to the Ohio Valley in order to find food, and there were brutally murdered, execution style, hacked to death, in fact, by a small number of American militiamen who had acted on their own. So in no time at all, this large group of Christian natives of 400 dwindled down to 17 people. Okay. Zeisberger is in jail, but he was finally acquitted. And when he got out, he spent the next few years trying to reorganize his congregation. And he was only partially successful. He could only ever manage to gather 150 people, who are folks, of course, who come to the Thames. But that infamous massacre in Ohio marks a watershed in the history of the mission, and it explains the Moravian presence in Upper Canada. This massacre happens in 1782. For the next 9 years, until 1791, the small group of 150 were moving about, up to Michigan, back down to Ohio. He always keeping a wary eye on the Americans, who at this time were still making war on other Indian tribes. And they feared them. Of course they feared them, because they were neutral, and they knew how the Americans felt about that. So they were refugees in a sense. Finally, in 1791, the British thought better of how they had treated these folks and offered them, to them to come across the Detroit River onto the Canadian side in 1791. The border was still very, very loose, of course, and so on, but still, across the Detroit River from Detroit was safety. And so the Moravians came. They were there for about a year, and then they received a huge land grant on the Thames. A huge land grant, and that made it possible to come to the Thames River. Now the land grant itself was made possible by the British Crown because it had just negotiated a huge section of southwestern Ontario from the local native population. It's called the McKee Purchase. It took in everything from Lake St. Clair up to what is, our own London today. And so therefore, the Moravians were given an entire township on which to settle. The land was supposed to be held in trust for the natives in England, as a matter of fact, with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. There never was a deed. We still haven't found it. At any rate, there they are. The spot that they chose, as I described it at the outset, was in Kent County. Well, it was Kent County today. I think it's Chatham, Kent today. Isn't that something like that? Yeah. Okay. Now, in 1792, Upper Canada had just been founded. The old, large province of Quebec had been cut into two, into Upper and Lower Canada. And so the Moravians were there almost at the outset of Upper Canada. And as I said before, the area was certainly a wilderness, where wolves and black rattlesnakes and bears certainly were not uncommon, and so on. The place in which they settled had no population whatsoever, 30 miles on either side. It was hardly populated. A few squatters down further on Lower Thames, illegal white squatters, I might add, and there was a Munsee Indian village further up the river towards London. It's still there today. Okay. But it was isolated, and they had chosen that spot for that purpose. They wanted to live in peace. They wanted to get away from a troublesome border. They wanted to certainly get away from any hint of Americans coming after them. But this isolation was an illusion, a big illusion, because the Thames River was the only highway as it were, between military presence between Detroit and Niagara. Anything that moved up and down that part of the world had to move on the Thames River. There were no roads. A few native trails, that was about it. So what you had is a steady flow of people, military personnel, would-be settlers, reconnoitering the area. Indians and hunting parties came through. And they didn't just, paddle by and wave hello to the Moravians. They all stopped. And Fairfield became a sort of a hospitality spot, if you will. Many people were provisioned there. So this isolation that Seisberg had hoped for was quite illusory. Of course, white settlements then grew rapidly because that was the idea. And 3 years after they founded the mission, Fairfield, Seisberg writes in his diary, "Oh my goodness, they're now 3 miles from our settlement. There was no one here in 30 miles radius when we first got here." So it was growing in leaps and bounds. Still, Fairfield was the largest settlement for a long time. It preceded Windsor, which was called Sandwich in those days. It preceded Chatham, certainly, and it most certainly preceded London, Ontario. Now, Fairfield was somewhat of an enigma to people, to outsiders. Yes, it was a pioneer farming community, that's what it looked like, but it was also a religious institution, and it was an Indian town. So it was multicultural in many ways. Now, the town itself, or the farming settlement itself, looked very much like a farming settlement in Eastern Europe at the time, where everybody lived together in the town, and they would have their fields around the town. They did not live as individual homesteaders on the land that they worked. Okay? There they are now on the Thames. Okay. The township that they got, I will show you. Can you see this there? Orford Township. Most of what is Orford today, and a little bit across the north side of the Thames, which is part of Zone Township today. This is what they received in their land grant. They built the town on the north side of the river, but most of their acreage and everything was south of the river. I just happen to have, there you are. This would have been how they saw the river in the wintertime. The town was well up here. Why? Because this is long before Fanshawe Dam, and the river, of course, flooded terribly every spring. So they had to find a high location, which they did, and that is a picture of one of their original churches. I redrew this illustration, this map from an original that Seisberg had actually drawn up himself. So you can see this was how the town was laid out. There's a main street that you saw in my first overhead. Eventually there would be a crossroad as the village grew. But you can see all the houses in a row, and the names of the natives are in here who lived there. It's high above the river. There's the river, of course. These are all garden plots. Every home had a garden plot behind it where they grew all sorts of things, lettuce, potatoes, cabbage, all that. Not all homes were built alike. Oh, by the way, they also had a cemetery. It's right here. They called it the Hootberg, or the Lord's Watch. It's a little further north of the village. And if you go down Highway 2 today, if you see the museum on the left-hand side, look to the right. There's an open field, but there's a clump of trees that was undisturbed. That marks the cemetery. And I do believe there are still bodies there today. Okay? This is why Delaware are wanting to negotiate to have that land returned to them. Okay. As I said, not all homes were built alike. A lot of them, of course, were built Moravian style like that of the time. It's hard for us to imagine today having even a family of 4 living in a hut like that. 20 by 17 was the largest room, and so on. The problem with these homes was that they were very poorly insulated. They tried to use, mud and so on, mud plaster to put between the logs, but that stuff dissolved when it was a heavy rain, so insulation was almost non-existent, which was really problematic in the winter. And Seisberger writes that it got so cold that his ink froze on the quill before he had a chance to put it on paper. Or the missionaries would wake up in the morning and there would be icy breath clinging, to their bedding. That's how cold it was. Still, with all of that, Seisberger thought that his natives were better housed than peasants in Europe at the time. Now, in terms of subsistence, missionaries had to farm to make a living. They were not paid for the pastoral services, all right? So they had to till their fields. Of course, they had the natives to help them and so on. But they were essentially farmers. They grew wheat, corn, of course, because they were with native peoples. A lot of corn was grown. Clover. They were the first ones in southwestern Ontario to grow clover. They had a whole lot of other firsts, too. They were the first to try their hands at grafting peach trees, keep bees, these sorts of things. Now, they also kept livestock, the usual cows, pigs, hens, all that sort of sheep, and so on. Now, what was true of the missionaries was true of the natives. They farmed as well. Okay, the main subsistence was farming. Okay, they had to support themselves as well, and for them, corn, of course, was the most important staple crop. But we can also say, the first natives from this mission were the first in Canada to grow wheat. They learned how to grow wheat, and so they made bread. They did all the things that the missionaries did. As I said, they grew an awful lot of corn, and when the harvest was good, they would supply merchants in Detroit with their surplus, and huge flotillas of canoes would set off to Detroit and supply companies like the Northwest Company with corn and so on. They also fenced their fields, and raised livestock. In those days, they didn't fence the livestock, they fenced the fields and let the livestock run loose to forage in the woods for fodder. So the natives did all that. And of course, they ran into the same problems as other farmers on the river. They had wheat. Mills for grinding were few and far between. And if it was a dry summer, they were water-driven, so they couldn't get them, couldn't get their wheat ground. Still, they would just boil it down, put some milk on it, and eat it that way. The missionaries turned to potatoes, but the natives didn't like potatoes much. Not at that point, anyway. Having said all that, I must tell you that Fairfield's natives also continued their traditional methods of Indian subsistence. They hunted, they fished, they gathered. And in many, many a winter, when things were not plentiful, what they gathered from the woods would see them through a terrible time. Natives in Fairfield were also given clothing and gifts from the British Indian Department, like all other natives who lived under British protection. And that was fine, it was good. Blankets, clothing, shot, powder, all the things that they needed for their subsistence. The trouble was they had to go to Detroit or Amherstburg once it was built in '96 to get it. The gifts weren't brought to them, they had to go and get them. And that brought a whole lot of other problems. Too many whiskey peddlers peddlers on the way. And the diary is simply full of tragic events when that happened. Now, because of the nature of the settlement, everyone living in the town rather than on the fields they farmed, Fairfield, from the outside point of view, a lot of people thought Fairfield was a commune, a collective farm, or something like that. That's not so. Each family lived and worked for its own subsistence. They knew the concept of private property and profit. They sold their excess and so on. Fairfield was never a commune. And Seisberger was quite perturbed that people would think that. And he said, and I quote one time in a diary, slanderous rumors against the community are that those who join the Brethren have to give up their property and live communally. Not so. Not so at all. All they had to ask was join the community and then live there and sustain themselves in a farming and hunting and traditional way. By the way, Fairfield had an Indian-only policy. White people could not join. They tried, and when he asked, they were always turned away. The missionaries' mandate, they said, was to work with leaders. Having said that, Fairfield people did some communal work, of course, because it was a religious institution. They needed to, pay for the upkeep of the schoolhouse, the church, communion, wine, bread for love feasts, which they held every once in a while, often actually. So they would have a communal field that they all worked, and the proceeds from that would go to defray the expenses of running that part of the mission. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail about the religious organization of this community. It was quite involved. It followed a well-established pattern. And the entire idea was to move converts along through a series of gradations until they reached the pinnacle of what Moravians thought was a true Christian, having attained Holy Communion. Okay, they had to understand and they had to believe what that meant for the Christian. And until they did, and their outward demeanor reflected that, they would not become communicants. They would be baptized. A lot of kids, of course, the children were baptized at birth, but they would have to work towards. It was not an automatic, they're 14 years old, they're going to have Holy. No, it was not like that. They had to work hard to become communicants. And sometimes it took years. Some people never made it. Okay, so the whole thing was very stringent. The question, of course, is often asked, well, were Indian conversions to Christianity bona fide? Were they legitimate? I mean, did native peoples really embrace Christianity truly, or did they give lip service simply for economic gain, comfort, etc.? And that's a matter of debate. It's been going on for many, many years. And I can only speak for Fairfield and what I know about this community. So the thing that we have to keep in mind there is that, first of all, most of these people have been exposed to Christianity for generations. Those who were born in the community knew no other religion. Then, of course, I think about the stringent system that was imposed upon them. And finally, we have to ask, we have to trust the word of the missionaries, because from every mission in the system, you have the same kind of report. Yes, we have backsliders. Yes, we have those who don't believe, but we're working on them. But we do have bona fide Christian natives. And so there you are. I mean, this is how it is left. I don't think the final answer is in there, Missionaries were very well aware that their young charges, children, youth, were going to be exposed to an English-speaking world that was growing around them in leaps and bounds. So they taught them how to speak English. These were German missionaries, most of whom did speak English. Some also spoke fluent Delaware. Zeisberger certainly did. So while they conducted religious services in the native tongue as much as they could, they would teach their children to speak English, to learn to read and write, and so on. In fact, Fairfield had the first school in southwestern Ontario. Now, despite their tragic history in the Ohio Valley, and despite the fact that they had been harshly treated by the British, the Moravians became a loyal citizen of Upper Canada. By accepting British protection, they owed and gave loyalty to the Crown, and they showed that in many ways. They celebrated the King's birthday duly every year. They prayed for England's safety and welfare in this long, protracted struggle against the revolutionary France, and so on. But loyalty to the Crown did not extend to military service. Remember, I said they were neutral. They claimed neutrality. Being neutral and being pacifist are two different things. Okay? They were not committed pacifists, but they remained neutral as much as they could in any conflict. In other words, they would not pick up guns and fight, but they would support those who did. Okay, so that makes them, in a way, make them show their loyalty to the British. Now, early on in '93, Governor John Graves Simcoe, our first Lieutenant Governor, came through Fairfield with his entourage, was most impressed with what he saw, and probably rubbed his hands in the knee and said, all these natives here, they'll work well in the defense of Upper Canada, because he knew, Simcoe knew well, that the issues between British North America and the United States, the newly formed United States, were not over. And of course he was right. Okay? But when Zeisberger told him, look, our Indians don't fight. We have taught them, according to scripture, to live in peace with all mankind, Simcoe was not that happy to hear that. Okay? But there it is. For the most part, Moravian Indians did not fight. There would be one or two, of course, who would be lured off to wars in the Northwest that the Americans were fighting, and a few would again be lured off to fight in the War of 1812. But in the main, young Fairfield men stayed put. Now, at the outbreak of the War of 1812, and I have to wrap up here, and this is the part I'm hoping that is going to be of interest. The mission had gone on the way I described it for all these years, 1792 to the War of 1812. Good years, bad years, good harvests, bad harvests, births, deaths, happiness, tragedy, all that sort of thing. The critical year was 1812. This is when the war was really heating up in that area, where all the fighting was going on in Detroit and in Niagara. And here are the missionaries living halfway in between. But they actually enjoyed a quiet, semi-quiet year in 1812. They knew the war raged all around them, and they hoped and they prayed that it wouldn't come to them. They got news of war all the time, people coming through, and still they hoped they could live in peace. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. But in terms of supporting and showing their loyalty to the British war effort, I want to read you an excerpt from the diary that shows you how they supported. This comes from August 6, 1812, and I quote, "John Norton, Iroquois chief and English captain, came here with 38 warriors. The brethren gave them plenty of food. Now since there was a shortage of deer meat, they received 1 ox, 2 calves, and 1 pig. Since he is to command the army of northwestern Indians, we beseeched him to spare human life, to abstain from murder and plunder, and to show himself as a servant of God going to war. With tears in his eyes, he gave us that promise. He will have 1,200 Indians under his command." The diary goes on to say, when he returned, the first thing he said was that he had kept his promise as far as his command had reached. John Norton was now the leader of the Grand River Iroquois, the Six Nation. And when they came through Fairfield, they were on their way to that fateful battle at Queenston Heights, August 6, 1812. And it is at that battle, and I'm sure you all know this, when the British managed to turn back a large invading American army coming across the Niagara River. And they were able to do that with the timely arrival of Norton and his men. We all know that Sir Isaac Brock was killed in that battle, but Norton and his men made sure that the British came out victorious. I don't think they often get credited enough with what they did. So the Moravians were loyal to the British cause, but you know what? Not everybody in that area appreciated that fact. And the reason for that is that the upper Canadian population in that area was a bit, worrisome. Brock certainly had worried, because a lot of these folks living on the Thames River, white folks, had come up as what we call late loyalists. Not particularly loyal to Britain. They had come for free land. They never had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. They had kinfolk living in the United States. And now that war was on, and they had been exposed to republicanism for a long time, many or some decided to help the American cause and engaged in traitorous activity. And again, I want to read something from the diary because it's kind of interesting. A few days after Norton had come through, the diarist in that year writes, quote, "A traitor to the country was brought through here on his way to prison in Niagara. His treasonous activity took place either in Delaware Township or at the Pinery," which is Ingersoll at the time, "and it could have caused a lot of trouble had it not been discovered. The ringleaders were caught and taken to Niagara, and we thanked the Lord that it was discovered, for the purpose was to destroy our village and our congregation. Actually," they went on, "now that there is war, some of our neighbors who used to call themselves our friends are now showing themselves as enemies and would do anything to see to the destruction of our mission." So there they are. I mean, they've been worried about Americans all along, and now their own local neighbors and friends, some of them, are turning on them. So in a war-torn 18th and early 19th century, genuine desire to live in peace with all mankind brought Moravians little reward. It had done them nothing, or had done them little good in the Ohio Valley, and it did them little good when the war was actually brought to their doorstep. And this is where I'm going to stop